You're listening to The Performance-Driven Warehouse, turning complex operational data into measurable performance. The modern warehouse looks nothing like what it did 20, 10, or even 5 years ago. Thanks to the speed of the markets, tech advances, and changing business processes, the warehouse itself has evolved into a complex network of people, systems, and automation. Balancing all of this to keep on top of volatility, disruptions, and even new opportunities is kind of an art form. Successful warehouse management depends on how well you can see everything that's happening across your network. And that network is powered by data. But what good is all the data in the world if it's not under the right lens and connected in a strategic way so you can understand and act on it? In order to gain the visibility to manage cost, performance, and capacity in real time, you need to unify your data. That's what today's warehouse performance management is all about. Hello, I'm Dan Keto. Welcome to the Performance-Driven Warehouse, where industry experts and operators share how they've transformed data complexity into operational clarity. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Easy Metrics podcast, where we dive deep into how warehouse operations leaders turn complex data into operational intelligence and measurable performance gains. Today, we welcome back our guest, Dwight Klappich. Dwight is a Gartner Fellow and Research Vice President who has spent more than 40 years studying supply chain technologies and advising some of the largest global enterprises. In today's conversation, we will dive a bit deeper into warehouse performance management and specifically discuss how artificial intelligence and machine learning is being used in the industry. Dwight, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. So, Dwight, there's a lot of hype about AI. Some of it's real, some of it's hype. So I'd like to just start with just asking you, what are the challenges you're seeing in the marketplace, specifically within warehouse operations, with the race to apply artificial intelligence to those operations?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The first problem is hype. To hear the media, it's going to be the end of the world. It's going to solve world hunger at the same problem and world peace. The problem is, I think for many of our clients in my past life, Gartner was, what do you mean by AI? I think it's one of the first challenges we see is we kind of use these terms generically and we'll start talking about generative AI or now agentic AI. And it's like, well, what problem are you trying to solve? And that was the biggest challenge we saw for some of our clients is they got tied up in hype. And wait a second, Gen AI is good for certain types of problems, but if you're trying to solve a travel path, optimization problem, that's probably not the right tool. We are often suggesting clients to really think about AI as a toolbox. Yes, I can hammer a nail in with a screwdriver, but that's probably not the right tool. If I have a nail, use a hammer. If I have a screw, use a screw. And then even when I get to that level, is it a Phillips head, is a flathead? And that's really been one of the challenges for many of the companies is just, trying to figure out what problem you think it can solve and then making sure that you're looking for the right types of tools to actually, solve that problem. And to be frank, is not get, too focused on the hype. I mean, in a travel path optimization, we've had traveling salesmen, algorithms for 50 years that might be the best tool, for something like that. Don't discount it because it's doesn't have that term, AI associated with it. And really, you say focus in on what problems are you trying to solve. Because, other aspects that we saw is there's different levels of maturity of some of these. And we saw a lot of people, just jumping into the deep end of the pool on Gen AI. And those were some of the least, mature solutions. And that was causing a lot of problems. They put a lot of time and money in there where they could have been putting that time and money into something where they'd have a more realistic solution in the short term for a lot less money.
So. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. What I'm kind of seeing in the market is there's this giant tool building phase going on right now. So you've got all the big AI technology companies creating all these great tools. Now they're looking for problems to solve with those tools. So instead of starting from the problem stage, saying, okay, I've got this problem, what's the best way to solve it? It's like, I'm building all these things. Now, how do I apply them? And one of the areas we see that I think the hype cycle got in front of itself is with visual AI. So using AI models applied to camera technology. I think it will eventually be a phenomenal game changer because with high resolution cameras and really complex algorithms, you can do some amazing things with it. But the cost to go build that algorithmic model of the visual, observation into the math is extremely expensive. And so there was, I think, a big rush into the market, pre-COVID, with some companies coming out with these technologies, and they kind of run into the reality is that it's a more complex build. You need much higher camera density. So instead of having a camera every 200 feet, you need a camera every 10 feet. And so then you have a whole different engineering problem, a processing problem, and so forth. So I think we're starting to perhaps enter what we call the chasm of disillusionment. That's that. I think Gartner, you guys might even come up with that. The different phases of innovation, where now it's like, okay, that hype cycle, all the excitement is there, a lot of money's poured in, but now we actually have to get ROI. And the thing I appreciate about supply chain is it's a very ROI driven mentality. You're moving boxes. Bottom line is you're just moving boxes.
Yep.
And so there's a certain cost to doing that. What can you do to drive that cost down? What can you do to drive the speed up? And that's where we're seeing now people stepping back a little bit to say, okay, how do we really drive the ROI? So,
let me
please
add something, because you bring up a good point. So I did one of Gartner's hype cycles, our transportation hype cycle, supply chain hype cycle for years. And one of the things our data found is that if you look at the hype cycle, you have the upslope. That's where you have, emerging technologies kind of on the upslope, and you get to the peak, we call it the peak of inflated expectations, at the top there. And then you kind of come down. You mentioned it's not the chasm, we call it trough of disillusionment. And then you see it's kind of like the phoenix rising. Some technologies just crash and never come back. Others, you go into that trough, and at some point they come out. A good example of a technology did that is you go back to the early 2000s was RFID. We got to the peak, it was, back in 2004 or 5. There are all these stories of going to solve world hunger, but there are all these concerns they're going to be tracking you from satellites. It crashed. And then over the last couple of years, RFID has been a hot technology, but it took 20 years for us to come out of that trough. But the other thing we found is that there's a certain class of company that it probably is set up to invest on that far left-hand side. They have the risk-tolerant culture. They're willing to put capital at risk without a guaranteed success. And our research found that was only about 18 to 24% of companies, and 24 was, they only having a lot. It was more like in that 20%. And that's a very unique, we used to call those the A-type companies. And those are the ones that have been investing, and they're willing to say, hey, we'll go invest in one of these vision AI initiative. It didn't work. Okay, it was a great idea. Maybe we learned something from it. We're going to put that off for a few years. But what we're seeing, I think the good news with AI is when you get over the trough, is companies start looking for solutions. You didn't say it, but what you're really saying, those companies are looking for, what's the solution? What's the problem this thing is going to solve for me? And then I know if I have that problem. They're not looking for a solution to they have a technology. Well, what problem can we solve? They're going, hey, I have this problem. A good example, you kind of look at, like you said, vision AI. Well, it's a technology. So, I'm looking for what could I do with vision AI? And those are huge systems integration projects. And we've seen some successes there, but they're fairly narrow. Had one company just monitoring potato chips as it went down the line, but it was completely built from scratch, as a manufacturing thing. What we get over the hump now are certain specific solutions that have that technology embedded. So it's really the technology getting embedded. And that's where the vendors like an Easy Metrics and others, that's when we'll start to see AI take off, because someone says, oh, I've got this travel path optimization thing as part of my picking logic or something like that, versus, hey, I've got these tools that, Google or someone will give me and I got to figure out what to do. And those are where we really see a lot of failures. And that's where most companies, they shouldn't even try. They should wait. It's either not going to go out of business, let it mature a little bit more. And I think that's the good news. I think we're at that point with AI, as long as we're realistic. We're not thinking it's going to solve world hunger, but the next 2-3 years is where we'll start to see that take off, because there will be more packaged. Maybe not 100% packaged, but much more packaged than a bunch of raw tools. Hey, if you write Python, you can do it. Well, no,
Yeah, I was in my business graduate program back in 1999. We had one of the professors there, and it was a business program for business owners. And so we had a very diverse group of companies. And the professor's like, if you're not a .com in 5 years, you're going to be out of business. And we had the founder of Jiffy Lube there. They changed oil and cars. We had someone who was a huge industrial farming equipment distributor, and service provider in Arkansas. I mean, huge conglomerates. And they're just looking at him like, how are we going to be out of business? And, then, so that was in 99. We watched the crash in 2000. And then in 2001 was the aftermath. And that professor was no longer in the program. I feel the AI thing is the same thing. Everyone's like, if you're not all in an AI, you're going to be out of business and all this. And it's like, no, it's a tool. It is going to transform. There's no doubt it's going to transform the world. It takes much longer than what people think.
Well,
the other thing go ahead. Sorry.
I saw this same thing with blockchain a few years ago. It was like blockchain, everything. If we're going to rewrite, and we kept going, well, wait a second. Database technology is pretty mature. What you're talking about with blockchain, it's not a basic generated database technology. Why? And sure enough, most of the vendors that were pushing that, they're out of business. But I mean, blockchain had a place. I mean, if it was the right problem, it was the right tool, but no, not every application was going to be built on top of blockchain.
Yeah, running your entire data structures on blockchain. I mean, the processing power you have to crank up to be able to handle that. It's crazy. Now, in the case of crypto, where you're literally getting that chain of custody, that transactional thing, that makes sense, because that's what they're trying to do is, for contracts and that sort of thing. So the other thing, going back to AI, I think, is a lot of people get confused about the term artificial intelligence because they're using it as this catch-all. And the consumer side of AI is the chat models, ChatGPT, image generation, and it's kind of cool. It's, it helps the creatives out. But within supply chain, I see AI as a really much more of a machine learning application, because we're really dealing with data. And not the language models. I mean, there are definitely cases in like customer service and things like that where the language models help. But when you're looking at operational workflows, it's not an LLM. That really is a machine learning process. Going back to your travel path optimization or workflow optimization, it really goes down to the math. And so what we're seeing, is there's a gap of expertise in the market. There's a desire. We would love to solve this problem, but you need to have that data science, that mathematical capability to take advantage of these tools, because you can't just go ask the tool to go do it for you.
Right.
You've got to go in there and you've got to construct these algorithmic models that do solve these problems. Are you seeing the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting because I think for some, like a good example, in your world of labor management, performance management, that you think about creating engineered standards. Basically we've been doing it the same way for the last 50, 60 years. It's a clipboard and a stopwatch. So some industrial engineer goes out on the floor and watches something, and you go, gosh, we've got this massive, data store, every transaction that we've done. Couldn't we start to apply, algorithms to that? So I think and then there's certain things, if we could, there's things that we could get that would be very hard with an industrial engineer, like fatigue. Okay, I could look over the course of time and say, well, geez, man, I see my performance consistently going down at 2:00 in the afternoon or right after lunch, whatever. We've viscerally known, and certainly professors talk about it, they do a study, but to actually do that in the real world, would be impossible. You'd have 100 industrial engineers trying to figure that stuff out. Now we can leverage the data that we're getting. And what we talked about in our last session is really puts an emphasis on managing data and all the challenges of building unified data models. But now we can start to say, hey, this is something we can really use this data to do that's very productive. And so you see certain things like that. I mean, slotting is another one where you hear terms like coming out of grocery, like market basket analysis, where I can start to say, well, let me look at the data and let me put, peanut butter and bread close to each other. I mean, that's obviously too good of an easy example, but there's others where you say, hey, look at we're Thanksgiving, we have cranberry sauce and stovetop stuffing and something else. That might not be as intuitive. So I think that's it. The challenge that we saw is, a few things is one, the data scientists making $250,000 a year is logistics where they're going to go. Probably not. There's much sexier places in sales and marketing and finance that really attract those people. They've also tried to use those as shared resources in companies. And again, logistics has been trying to compete to get access to those data scientists because that's a constrained resource too. So again, this is why we felt that the vendors were really going to help a lot of companies, because a lot of companies that weren't going to be able to do this on their own because they just couldn't get the resources, but they could fall back on some of their vendors or some consulting companies to provide that expertise.
This goes back to what we discussed in the last podcast, where, really bringing in all the different stakeholders. Because one of the things we've seen is you have a data scientist, mathematical wizards. They know how to crunch data. They know how to do all these just amazing things, and they can see patterns in the data. The problem is they don't have the context of the operation. And so I remember we met with a large technology division of a forklift equipment company. And their data scientists had gone through and said, hey, if you do deep cycle charging on the batteries, you're going to extend the battery cycle 20%. So that battery will be 5 years life cycle versus 4 years life cycle. And that's going to save you, $15,000 over that 5 years on the batteries. And that's like, well, that's great. But then when you actually look at the labor cost of doing the deep cycle charges versus doing the quick charges, you are actually saving about $2,000 a month in labor by doing the quick cycle charge, but you're losing 20% of that battery life. So when you look at the holistic thing, the holistic story, it's like there's a reason they were doing it this way. But the data was saying, because they're looking at the battery life, not looking at the operational efficiencies, you get this disconnect. And so this is, as you go through these different processes, you need to have all the thinkers in the company in the room together, because, I'm solving a problem here, but it creates another problem there. And so we have to always balance that, when you're trying to build these holistic solutions. And we've seen this over and over again with just taking a pure engineering approach, not marrying it to business process and discussions with other people who are actually working the process. Because it's like, the data says this, but you're only looking at one lens of it. If you look at it from this end, it says something completely different. So you really need to bring that together.
And they don't even know. I mean, it's like I've seen some statistics, the last couple of years that, accidents, and, safety events have gone up in warehousing. Well, if you've been around warehousing, like I mentioned fatigue, but you start pushing people, or they're driving faster, or they're trying to pick up 3 boxes at once instead of 2 boxes at once, and they end up injuring their back. So you say, well, gosh, if all I focus on is picking efficiency and how many cases per hour I'm doing, that looks great. But if you don't realize that there could be, another, issue that crops up, and I think the context is something we often overlook. I used to, say that, give me a consultant that understood warehousing more than who understood a product. They could learn any WMS, for example, just what's the context of that. But if you don't understand what goes on in a warehouse, you don't understand concepts like task interleaving, wave planning, some of these things. You might understand, how to certain piece of software is built, but you're not going to bring anything to the table. So context, I think, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I totally agree there, and think that's again going to this trial of disillusionment. It's like, okay, now we have to bring the context to the tools, find the ways to solve the problems with those tools, and go through that internal R&D process to really get it vetted and baked into the system. So let's going, let's looking at AI. What do you think in the short term are the easy wins with AI machine learning? I mean, let's kind of lump them together. As we've talked about, it's really more machine learning, I think, in a lot of operational environments than just pure AI. But let's just kind of consider them the same, applying really advanced technology tooling to solve problems. So, in the next 2 to 3 years, where do you think the easy wins are going to be, and the areas that companies can pick up some quick ROI if they were to invest in? Then we can talk about the longer term ones you think that might be coming down the road.
Yeah, I think again, if you said it before, warehousing logistics is good news. Bad news is they're very efficiency, productivity focused because it's a cost of doing business, or it contributes to the profit of the business. So they're maybe sometimes too myopically focused on what are those things that can drive greater levels of efficiency and profitability or performance. So that's you start looking at, what are the big drains on efficiency and productivity. So it's this labor is probably one of the key focal points, because that's one of the biggest, operational costs for somebody is labor. So how do I drive more efficiency? So some of that, could directly relate to, hey, setting engineered standards in an LMS. So again, that's potential machine learning or an algorithmic problem. But then it's obviously other things is like, well, am I telling them the right thing to do? So like I talked about travel path optimization, where if I'm doing task interleaving, am I actually assigning them productive work? They might be as absolutely productive as they could be, but if it's, I'm traveling from one end of the warehouse to the other, now that's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's what you told me to do. That's not very efficient. So I think that, slotting, labor management, travel path, some of these things, they naturally fit. There's lots of data there. We're ripe for that. I have to be honest. There wasn't a lot of pent up demand because of what we talked about the other day. I think warehousing continues to be a little bit behind manufacturing and really looking to adopt, more advanced algorithms. You look at your basic WMS today, you look at, task interleaving, it's a simple heuristic process. Now, there's no reason we couldn't apply more advanced math, and some vendors are starting to do that. That's kind of where we've been, and many of the customers haven't gotten much beyond it. So it's those types of things that are directly related. I can say that I've gotten more throughput. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of this going on in automation or robotics. That's a whole separate, topic, but it's also how would I assign work and make sure that the robots are being efficient as well. So I think those are some of the key places. I mean, there's other places where Gen AI has some opportunity, more affecting like usability, more of a conversational type of user interface for some of these systems where I can query the systems and do some of those things. A lot of interest, in those types of things. But from actually drive, I think, these types of things are going to be easier to cost justify. You say I can get 10% better performance out of my warehouse, I can hang a number on that fairly easily, where, okay, some of the Gen AI use cases are kind of nice. I used to call them B movie type of stuff. Some of those, sex and violence is like, it's cool, but it doesn't really add much to, so we'll have to see how some of that, but a lot of vendors are spending a lot, on that end. So.
Yeah, to your point, I think there's definitely a huge opportunity for improvement in workflow optimization.
Yep.
So, going back to the WMS is getting smarter in how the work is allocated. When we look at operations, the low hanging fruit is always what we call missing time. It's just people standing around because they don't know what to do, or the system's not directing them. And anytime you walk to an operation who hasn't gone through like a labor management stand-up process, you'd be kind of amazed at just how many people are standing around waiting for things to occur. And without that visibility into that, when I see 10 people just waiting for something, it's like I'm watching hundreds of dollars an hour go out the door. And that adds up throughout the day. And so when we look at, like our solution, we're always focused on really identifying where all the waste is and then adjusting process, coaching, training, things like that to make sure people are always thinking ahead so that, they go from one task to the next, not waiting to be told what to do. That actually increases productivity dramatically because now they become much more intentional in their work. There are cases where people need, coaching and observations to really help them understand how to do a process better. But the easiest one is really getting through that workflow optimization, making sure that they're always moving and following that path. As we bring in automation, it gets even more complicated because, equipment has a certain pace that it can operate. So then now you have to figure out, how do I schedule my workflows through the different equipment, through the people, so I am optimizing off on that very large capital expenditure in that equipment. I mean, the worst thing you can have is a $50 million piece of equipment sitting there that's only running at a 40% utilization. You're burning a lot of cash because that cost is 24/7 as far as your lease costs and such on that equipment.
Oh yeah, and then one of the
Mhm.
other problems, I mean, this goes back to the unsophistication of some of these, task interleaving, very common, cool in a WMS. I basically used to say it was last next. What was the last thing you do? I'll give you the next best thing to do. Well, if you think about the game of chess, the greatest chess players are thinking 5 moves down. And so you'll see a situation where you'll see a lot of wasted travel time because I got all my assets and people on one side. Then I got to go all the way to the other side of the warehouse. Well, gosh, if I thought about tying 5 transactions together, not as, hey, do this in some sort of sequence, I could make that much more efficient than taking every single transaction and going, okay, didn't think about anything. Now, what's the best, example of this? And so I think that's I think we're ripe for this because we basically tapped out the systems. I mean, I used to use the example of squeezing a sponge. You dip a sponge in a bucket of water and you pull it out. Then you don't have to squeeze it very hard and a lot of water comes out. But you just keep squeezing that and you're to a point in time where you're squeezing that thing as hard as you can to get a drip and a drip. And that's kind of where we are on some of those rudimentary systems and warehousing. We've taken them as far as we can go. Now, this is, again, the context. A lot of warehouse managers know, gosh, one of the things they can be standing around sometimes is like, well, I have gaps in work like e-com. I get a flurry of orders at one point in the day, but I'm not doing anything. Maybe I did all my receipts and I got like 2 or 3 hours where there's not a lot going on. And then, it's total panic, at the end of the day when I've got all these orders. Well, are there any things that I could be doing, in that downtime? We haven't given them the tools to help them figure that stuff out. So a great warehouse manager, probably says, I know I'm going to have this 2 or 3 hour gap every day. Let's do something. Most companies just, it's wasted time and then total panic when they're trying to get everything out the door at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'll give you a real world example of that. Prior to starting Easy Metrics, we ran a production outsourcing firm. And so we were running some very large cross-docking operations for companies like Walmart, Target, Home Depot. And the employees were heavily incentivized. And one of the facilities was we were turning about 20,000 containers a year. And it takes about 30 minutes to, once you call out to the yard go driver to come in and turn the container. So you offload the container and, then you call it, they flip it. Well, because the employees were on such heavy incentive pay, they came up with the idea. It's like, okay, 15 minutes before they're done with the container, they would call out to the yard go driver to basically get it ready to turn, and then they would finish offloading it, clean it, the person turns it. And so they were able to basically shave 15 minutes of production time, downtime, waiting for that container to turn over. So it's just these little things like that. But when you run that, say, okay, we just saved 15 minutes per 20,000 containers. How much money is that? That's 5,000 hours of labor a year that you just shaved by thinking ahead in the process versus just running things like this. I'm thinking 5 steps ahead. So I'm almost done. I'm going to call it out and there we go. And so these stories show up in data. And I think that's the big iteration that is coming with AI and all these things is how do we find these opportunities in data with these algorithms? And there's a lot of intellectual property that goes into it. But when you look at the scale of the supply chain, the volumes these groups are doing, these little minutes here and there that you save turn into millions and millions of dollars, especially for your big companies like the
Oh, that's it.
UPSs
Yeah.
and
I mean, and
XPOs and
that's the
so
other
forth.
thing in warehousing is they are doing, in some cases, millions of transactions. And this is why previously, we still see WMSs fairly heavily customized. And I often tell somebody, do a business case in any customization. But if I'm doing something, I mean, I had clients, 250,000 order lines in a day out of a single warehouse. Well, if you could save a second or two on one of those transactions and you add that up over the course of that's real money. The regret, the thing, just to add, we talked about last week, is that you take a great warehouse manager, just viscerally understand some of this stuff, and they would probably be going back to their WMS vendor and say, I know the way your system works today is I don't schedule, the other container come in until I complete the last task. So that's the way the system's set up. When you complete this last task and send a message out, I want to put a customization in there that says that we're going to estimate this. We're going to send that message out 15 minutes early. And actually, we saw times where vendors would like fight stuff like that. But he knew that, or she knew that, because that just understood. They saw this. Our problem is that not every warehouse has that person, and it's there in the data. And we could really help a lot of companies when we start to be able to look at these things, find these little pockets. But it's going to take, like I say, I'm not trying to sell for you, vendors like yourselves that can say, we have this opportunity. We see something that's really going to be beneficial, because, a lot of these companies, warehouses, managers been in the job for 9 months, brand new. He's not the guy that's been around for 35 years that just kind of, hey, I'm seeing this. Well, it looks like if we could turn this around in 15 minutes, what do we have to do? Oh, hey, we need to let them know 15 minutes early. Okay, let's figure out how we let them know it 15 minutes early.
Yeah, not to continue to pick on the WMSs, but it's been shocking for me is like we've had clients that where our product is installed, they have a WMS, then they come in and have a WMS optimization. So they bring in a outside consulting firm, they do a bunch of reconfigs on the WMS to make the workflow better. And it's shocking how dramatic the improvements for productivity are by just reworking that WMS. And so some people, they just come in, they say, let's install this solution, but you have to be extremely thoughtful when you architect that software, because a good implementation versus a bad implementation can have a dramatic swing in what your throughput capability is and your productivity costs are. And so that's where I think the WMS vendors really need to start looking at these technologies of AI and ML to help identify those things for each of these operations. Okay, how can we optimize these workflows to continually compress down those cycles in the facility?
Yeah, it'd be nice to have some of this data actually ahead. I was looking at my previous life, I was talking to a lot of companies about robotics and automation, and something I realized very quickly was they were jumping, automation is going to solve my problem. And regrettably, we quite often saw that they put a lot of money into something and then it didn't accomplish what they had hoped it would accomplish. And so I was telling a lot of companies that one of the questions I'd ask is, do you have even a rudimentary labor management system? You might have a WMS, and maybe run an SAP or Oracle or somebody else, and been running, it's running successful, but they're not really doing the analytics, at the level of an LMS. And I said, I would highly recommend you go do that first, because you're liable to be putting a lot of money into automation and going at the wrong problem. Really, if I solve this problem, and again, good warehouse managers might viscerally understand that, hey, I got a real problem with truck unloading. That's what I'm going to focus on, because I know I can't keep people for more than 3 weeks, and I've got these issues, and they'll go focus there. But some of the other things we saw, like heavy payload transports, autonomous lift trucks, these things are expensive, and people would go buy it, and then they realize, geez, we didn't get the payback, because that really wasn't a problem. It was actually, like we talked about once before, is I'm giving people things I could do with a pallet jack, but I'm giving them to my high reach truck because of inefficiencies in my process. Well, no, fix your process. So you're giving them the $30,000 asset versus the $300,000 asset to do that. Yeah, high reach can move a pallet from A to B, but kind of an expensive tool. Oh, but so I highly recommend it. It comes back to that: understand the problem, where the key is. Is that going to solve my problem? Maybe by putting in the labor. Man, I find I don't need the automation. I've really improved my process to the point that it solves my problem. So other times, no, it helps. No, I really do need to bring in some robots to help with that. So
Yeah, there's this allure of the fully dark facility, fully automated. And, I've been into some Amazon facilities and they're amazing. I mean, they really, these things are hundreds of millions of dollars that they stand up. But they still have tons of people in there, even though there's tons of the Kiva robots. They bought Kiva and they've got all little robots scurrying around and the conveyors and all sorts of stuff. But there's still tons of people in there. And so you've optimized certain parts of the process, but then you've shifted things elsewhere. And I really question if we'll ever get to that point of a truly fully dark, fully automated facility. I mean, it's always theoretically possible, but is that really just the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that as you get close to it, it keeps moving on you? Because I've seen that going to the automation forklifts. We were talking to the forklift companies, a decade ago, and they were saying, oh, it's, 5 years away. And talk to them today, it's still 5 years away. It's just, there's so many variances that occur. A piece of paper sitting in the aisle, the camera stops and goes, okay, what do I do? Because it can't quite recognize that. So I'm just curious, your thoughts as far as the pipe dream. Do you think it will be a reality where we'll have a fully automated, highly variant distribution facility, or do you think it's always going to be this hybrid human and automation type environment?
well, you use the word twice, variant, in the last 2 seconds, and I think that's the operative world. I have seen, I would not call them dark, but they were dark gray warehouses. I mean, I had one that went from like 500 people to like 50, and half the 50 were the people keeping the automation going, and the other 25 were doing some tasks that the math didn't work out. Today, I think the math would work out. They're doing, loading and unloading trucks. They might have done that. However, this was a pallet in, pallet out business. 85+% of their business, if not more, was moving full pallets. Had the biggest ASRS I'd ever seen. And that was it. The pallets came out of the factory, went across the street, got inducted into this giant ASRS system. They pulled pallets out. Yeah. What did that have? It was low variance. Very, very low variance. And the part that was variant, that's, to your point, is where they had the people. But now you go into an e-com warehouse, like an Amazon warehouse. I mean, I had a client that was sporting goods, and they came to me one day and they're using their giant, I can't remember if it was his auto store or Advascent or one of those at the time. And they come to me and they go, Dwight, are there any robots that can do canoes and kayaks and skis? And I go, no. They go, why? And I said, well, think about the variability. I mean, a kayak could get an 8, a 9, a 10, a 15-foot, a double, a single, a ride-in top, a sit inside. It's like, oh, now you want to do a canoe. You have floats on the water, but look at it. Too much variance. I mean, this is the allure of humanoid robots, but I mean, I think we're 20 years away from humanoid. So it's the degree of variability, I think will keep people employed for a long time. And then it'll come down to the cost. I mean, the cost to automate, some process. I mean, labor is still going to be cheaper and it's more flexible. And, so I don't think people are going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's nice to hear it from you because there's so much, you see the Optimus robots on Twitter or whatever doing backflips and stuff. You're like, well, they're getting good, but how much of that is real and how much is that is the, video generation, I guess.
Well, you told me just a real quick one. It's a real short story, but there was one of the heavy payload transfer robots told me a funny story years ago. And it goes exactly to the story you were telling. Is they had deployed their robots when they first went out. Things were great, but a few months in, they said, your robots are terrible. They're not following the path they're supposed to follow. And we want to take them out and we want our money back. So they sent their engineers out to figure what was going on. Well, this warehouse had a trash problem. They did not handle trash very well. So somebody finished something, it was slip, she just throw it on the floor. Their robot was told not to run over anything because it didn't know. It couldn't tell that there wasn't a hole in the floor that if it drove over this piece of corrugator as a pallet, it couldn't move the pallet. And so that's what they figured out. I mean, it comes again back to context is the robot was actually doing exactly what it was trained to do. The problem was the process problem. And so then they said, well, no, we have to be more disciplined in handling some and just not leave trash in the middle of the aisle. So yeah, I think, that really comes down to, again, it comes back to our whole thing with data and then understanding what the data is telling you. So,
Yeah. So in the short term, we talk about data, like WMS optimization, labor management optimization, things like that. Where do you see, like with AI and ML, maybe in 5 years, as we kind of emerge from this trial of disillusionment into reality, where do you see some really big potential gains? Like I do think visual AI has a big opportunity, but I look at it like when they did CAD drawings back in the late 90s. Someone went out and bought all the CAD drawings from all the engineering companies. So you have a little bolt, right? So anytime you were a CAD worker, you would have to engineer each bolt and put everything together to create your car or your plane or whatever. Well, then now you could go in, and so for $10 you could buy that digital bolt, and then you could just assemble everything, build that, you're building that library of drawings. I see the visual AI kind of having to go through that same process where taking the human movements, all these different visual things, building that library of information. Then once you have access to that, you can really start getting some of the value out of it. So I think, probably in 5 years, we'll see the camera enabled AI start getting a lot, some really good traction beyond just those like potato chip use cases you've talked about. What other areas do you think, longer term, because you've seen so many different new technology companies, that you think will start getting some really good traction as they kind of refine their business models?
well, I mean, I think there's some things I think that probably aren't obvious that I think have some real potential for Gen AI and Agentic AI. One is going to sound trite, but I look at the way WMS systems are implemented today. I was in the warehouse business in the 1980s, and we implement those systems fundamentally the same way today that we did there. 8 to 15 week design, 8 to 15 week config. Basically, I'm going through, describe your warehouse, describe some of that. I think there's real potential for us to use things like AI to help us in that implementation, is through, kind of a scripted workflow, kind of wizard, help me, almost like we would do TurboTax to reduce the amount of time. I mean, also just warehouse systems, they tend to not be maintained as well as they could be for the same reason as, it takes a lot of time. So that's a unique use case. We've seen some vendors, and I think we're a ways away from that, but what we would hope there is something we've alluded to, is that we could drive the implementation of the system based on the goals and objectives we had it for improving the operations of our warehouse. So if we can get there, that's going to be a huge game changer. Just say, look, I need to, whatever I implement today, I want it to help me be 10% more, effective than I am today. That would be great.
Now, yeah, I want to touch on that one, because that's actually a big initiative we have internally, is that we're building an agentic system to streamline the implementations. Because, when you go do a labor management implementation, there's a tremendous amount of data scrubbing and really getting everything tied up. But when you actually go through the process, there's a lot of binary decisions. Okay, if it does this, do this. If it does this, do that. And so we're building that all into an agentic system. So we think by the end of next year, we will be able to streamline and automate, 80 to 90%, if not all, the implementation from that technical side of hooking up all the software. Because that, I agree with you, that's a very big opportunity, because it's agentic AI for me is really kind of streamlining a lot of administrative work.
Yep.
Things where people are having to go in there and, okay, I need to do this or I need to do that. You can train an agent to do that. And that's a big initiative on our end, is to really layer a lot of different agents in there to minimize the click paths and how much time people have to go in and find stuff.
Well, and the beauty of that, I think, is that, WMSs, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, have been so dependent on the quality of the team, the company team, and the quality of the consultants that come in. And that's why I went back and I said, give me, a set of consultants that understand warehousing viscerally. I don't care what WMS, they're probably going to do a better job than someone that understands a vendor that doesn't really understand. So that stuff, I mean, the beauty, and we've seen this come out of the robots, is the beauty of AI is train one, train them all. If we can get some of these models, they don't have to be 100% day one, but if they're 50%, but everybody starts at that 50%, think how much further along we are. So I'm thinking we're not going to not have people involved. It's just like if you had a super complex tax, and a lot of, property and stuff like that, you're probably not going to be an out of the box, TurboTax user. You might need a little help, but if you can get 50% of the basics done, then you could get your accountant involved. Same thing here. So I think it's even with Agentic AI, I'm afraid of no human in the loop. I mean, we don't want to leave that. But if you're arming those humans with better tools to really say, hey, I need you to help me. I've gotten to a point in this where someone's going to have to make a decision. Now you've given them all the information to help them make that decision better, faster, quicker. And you can be doing that far enough in advance. I saw projects come to a screeching halt in the past where they were told, hey, you need to make a decision on this. And nobody did. And we're 10 weeks into an implementation. They just have to put it on hold. We can't move forward until we make this decision. Well, we could help through that. So that's one with Agent. I think the other problem is that you go to a lot of warehouse managers today, they still take pride in being good expediters. This is where warehousing and manufacturing are quite different. Manufacturing, I have a schedule, there's enough complexity, and I know I need to make these widgets over this time, and sure, problems come up. Warehousing, I have thousands of individuals, sometimes, like I said, hundreds of thousands of individual events that I have to manage over the course of the day. And yeah, a lot of those, they just flow no problem. It's the problems that, really, cause a lot of heartache. If I could give the people that have to make decisions, and now it's a different form of this, so I think Agentic AI has the more real-time decisions, and they're not machine learning. We'll use that. The machine learning might help this, but hey, I get to a point in time where there's a problem. Hey, I need either go left or right. I need to figure out what's a better way for me to go on a particular transaction, particular point in time. I think we're going to be giving particularly the supervisory workforce more information to do than we've given them in the past. They used to here's a report. They'd have to comb through that report to try to make a decision, or we are always giving them data the day after. Well, I already tried to fix the problem, right or wrong, where I think, I think we're going to be able to start to use some of this that, it's conversational. Hey, do I have any, problems with orders? Oh, it looks like this order's at risk. Help coach me through what are my options? I could steal inventory from this order. I could do this, or I could, hey, it looks like the people in receiving are pretty light. And I know Charlie and Sally can, they're qualified to do packing. Let's move them over to packing. Today, I think those are examples, but we just don't have that. So
yeah, I completely agree. I think agents are an empowering tool. I think full autonomous agents, especially in distribution, are a long ways away. The criticality of being completely accurate is so important for customer satisfaction. And so just allowing the systems to do everything and all of a sudden you're having bad shipments go, I mean, that is just devastating to the business. So I think having people involved in that critical decision process will occur. And then the agents are used to help elevate the problem and say, okay, please tell us what to do.
But I think that's example I gave, you're absolutely right. And that's why I think it's a human in the loop. But today is what's the warehouse manager going to see? They're going to say, look, packing's backed up. I could write a pretty simple report that flashes yellow on my screen. That says, look, we're behind schedule in packing. That's what we give the warehouse manager today. That's what he knows, he's behind schedule. Now they got to go figure out, and they go, look, do I have any people that I could move into packing? They've been trained in packing or whatever, and they're digging through it. Oh, there's Sally and Johnny. That's something where I think Agentic AI, we could get them to information that would help them make that decision much faster than what they have today. Because basically here's a problem. And then they have
or even better, we know at 2:00 we know at noon that at 2:00 packing's going to be backed up. So get ahead of it, get some people over there, and then you can work through it so you don't have those bottlenecks. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this. I think, as we evolve in this process, it really comes down to constraint management. Especially when we bring in automation, it's about how do we keep that stream of work going at all times versus bottlenecking. Because when you get those bottlenecks, it just blows up the floor. I mean, I've seen it so many times in our own operations. It's like, when you get on your heels like that, it's like next thing you know, it's mandatory overtime for everybody trying to get through it all.
Well, that's the solution. And sometimes The other problem, and I think this is things where logistics could learn from manufacturing, because the problem's complicated enough in manufacturing, but hey, I can only make this toothpaste on these two lines. Okay, it's complicated enough. I have to know, but the person says, "Well, I'm supposed to make 100,000 units, but I think I can get away with only making 50,000 units." My system can say, "Well, yeah, your forecast says, and you'll be okay." Well, manufacturing, that's tough enough, but again, in warehousing, that 100,000 units is 50,000 individual orders, and I've got some complication there. So I think this is a place ripe for some of this stuff. I think the other piece and we've talked about this with, the warehouse performance management, and some of that is too much of what we've given warehouse managers. The systems have been very transaction oriented, task oriented. Do this task efficiently, but we haven't really given. So you've mentioned a few things. Hey, being able to look out more predictive type of analytics, is that AI or not? But I mean, it's hey, I have the information. Let me look out and say, you don't have a problem now, but it looks like the way we go. And some of that machine learning could be, I know we've got this already, but we know that typically we're going to get 20,000 orders, to process in the last 4 hours of the day. So we can predict is like, okay, if you're here now, by the time we get those orders, we're in a real problem. Today, that's all seat of the pants. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here, but all driven towards making better decisions.
So we're getting to the top of the hour here. I just have one last question for you. Is just for what we're seeing as the finance world is really kind of driving companies to have an AI initiative in their organizations. I whatever it is the money powers that be are like, everyone has to be doing AI. So for in the supply chain warehouse operation world, what would be your recommendation to these operators if they do want to start an AI initiative? Where would you recommend they begin?
That's a tough one. I think we've talked about some of this I think some of these, they know where their pain points are. And to focus on specific areas, not some amorphous AI thing, but say, hey, if we could, start the sentence off that way, address this. Is like, it seems like you talk about wasted time. Since we're having some of these systems already that can help you with this stuff, is, hey, if we can fix this by 30%, this is what it's going to mean to me. I mean, start focusing your initiatives there, because I think when people's aspirations get too big, this is where we see projects go on, millions of dollars spent, and they're killing the project after 3 years, and sometimes killing people's, careers. And then on some of these, be aware, hey, do something, you might do something different in 4 or 5 years, but also be somewhat realistic in, where are we at in the marketplace and what your company is. I used to tell companies this all the time, is if you're a conservative late adopter of technology, don't do blockchain. I used to say this when I was covering blockchain. I literally, if someone said they want to talk about blockchain, first question I'd ask them is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how risk tolerant is your organization? If they'd say 8 or below, I'd say don't bother. If you're 6 to 8, put a little skunk work, get a couple young kids on the side that want to play around with, Hyperledger or something like that, but don't expect real commercial. Don't sell it. If you're highly risk tolerant, okay, go spend hundreds of thousands or $1 million. Maybe you join some consortium if you're 68. Said you're 6 below, wait. And I would say the same thing. There's plenty of other things someone can be investing in, because what we find is when they invest too early and the projects fail, we saw this with RFID companies. It took a long time because, the finance guy who you mentioned said, we wrote off $2.5 million on his project in 2006. His RFID projects. I'm not going to do it. Believe it or not, we saw this with voice. Voice technology was super mature. But we would talk to people just even the last few years that they had some failed voice project 15 years ago that they were struggling to get the money to do, even though the technology matured. Because that's the thing you want to be careful if you're not that A-type company, is that you make a mistake now, then your chance to circle back in 2 years when it's ready might be bad. So that's why I focus on places where you think it's a real high win. You understand the problem, you know their tools. Make sure that you're not having to go build something. Realistic about it.
Great. Well, Dwight, once again, thank you so much. That was an excellent conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you.
All right. You take care.
Okay.
Subscribe to the Performance Driven Warehouse wherever you get your podcasts. For proven data strategies and guidance on warehouse performance management, visit easymetrics.com. Until next time, let data lead your performance and never stop improving. Keep turning complexity into performance.